let's talk about the slave girl for a little bit. The slave girl the first thing we know about her is that she was young. Okay, so the word for slave girl in the Greek is the word padiske, which I'm probably pronouncing wrong, but it refers to a female child maid or servant, which means she was probably between the ages of 10 and 14. This is a very young girl that Paul and Silas come across. In fact, as we read, Paul and Silas meet Lydia first, who served a business owner, a cosmopolitan woman. We'll talk about her next week. But then we had this little section on the slave girl. And the slave girl follows Paul and Silas around saying, these guys are prophets of the Most High God. So her doctrine is spot on. Okay? And the reason for that is because she's demon-possessed, which we'll talk about here in a minute. So because she was so young, she was likely either sold into slavery by her parents for monetary reasons. She was either kidnapped for this trade, much as the sex trafficking industry flourishes today, or she was orphaned. Okay? And so according to this passage, this girl was in bondage not only to her owners, but in verse 16, also to a spirit of divination. And so most English versions have spirit of divination, but if you were to read it in the Greek, what the phrase actually is the spirit of the python. So that was a specific spirit that this lady was possessed with. And so the spirit of the python was the name of the mythological serpent slain by Apollo in Greek mythology. Apollo was one of the main Greek gods. And in the worship of Apollo, there was a prophetess called the Pythia, which is derived from the word python. Pythia, python, okay? And so she served, this Pythia, there was one Pythia who served at a time. This Pythia served as Apollo's main prophetess, but she was known to be possessed by the spirit of the python whom Apollo had killed. Does that make sense? So there was a time during ancient Greece when the Pythia was without a doubt the most powerful woman in the classical world. People came from all over Greece and beyond to have their questions about the future answered by the Pythia, who lived at the shrine of the Delphic oracle. And so there was literally a shrine that she lived in. There was one, much like the Pope today, there was one Pythia at a time. When she died, she was replaced by another Pythia, and that woman lived and was called the Delphic oracle. So the Pythia gave oracles and predictions from the spirit of the python, and the word for this spirit of the python was actually later the equivalent word in Greek for soothsaying ventriloquist. Later became a synonymous term. So this slave girl that we read about in Acts 16 was not the Pythia, but she was sort of a disciple of the Pythia, okay, who gave prophecies and predicted the future. So this slave girl was enslaved in three ways. Number one, she was enslaved to her owners. She was enslaved to this spirit of the python. And lastly, we can kind of say she was enslaved to her body. She was stuck in a child's body. Three things we're going to talk about from this story. First of all, we're going to talk about the oppressive cycle of servitude for the slave girl. We're also going to talk about the power struggle for freedom for this girl. And then lastly, we're going to talk about the undeniable difference the gospel makes. So this girl was enslaved in three ways. This girl was out of control of herself in every way possible. Okay? Other people told her what she would do every day. A spirit told her what she would think every day. And a youthful body told her what she was worth every day. She was an abandoned child. Okay? And so if we were to modernize this girl and make her present day, we could say that she is like the drug-addicted prostitute who makes money by her pimps. Okay? Her pimps tell her what she will do every day. The drugs tell her what she will think every day. And her body tells her what she's worth every day. She's worth nothing more than sex. Okay? So this girl feels controlled because of her pimps. She feels crazy because of the drugs. And she feels dirty because of the sex, although for her, sex wasn't involved. But she's like the drug-addicted prostitute that we have today. So no one is lower or more powerless on the society scale than this slave girl. But not only is she out of control of herself, the whole societal system is against her too. So I want you to think about a couple things. When Paul and Silas set this girl free from the spirit, you would think, like we talked about last week, that the people of Philippi would kind of gather around her and say, yeah, we don't care if you slumlords are losing money. She's free. This is good. Leave Paul and Silas alone. But instead, the opposite happens. The slumlords drag Paul and Silas into the city streets, and Philippi gathers around them and say, yeah, they're making money. Lock them up. So not only is her body's against her, her mind's against her, and her owners are against her, but the whole city of Philippi is not on her side. So I want you to notice some things here. That a couple things we see about the city. We see what these people really care about, and we see what these people really don't care about. So what do they really care about? Well, notice how the slave girl's masters they phrase the problem. Right? So they drag Paul and Silas into the city streets, and what do they say the problem is? In verse 20 they say, these men are Jews and are throwing our city into an uproar by advocating customs unlawful for us Romans to accept or practice. So first of all, these guys are horrible liars. And here's why. First of all, the city was not thrown into an uproar because Paul and Silas set the slave girl free. The city was thrown into an uproar because these men dragged Paul and Silas into the city streets screaming at the top of their lungs. That's why people are, what's going on? That's why there's an uproar. People, they would have never known about the slave girl if it wasn't for these guys dragging these guys into the street. So secondly, they said these men are advocating customs and practices unlawful. So what customs and practices are they talking about? None. They don't have a clue what Paul and Silas are teaching. All they know is that they're losing money. The Philippians are not concerned with Roman nationality or Roman fidelity as they say they are. They are concerned about profits. So what the Philippians really care about is profits. What they really don't care about is the slave girl. Understand, folks, that the gods of the ancient Greeks and the gods of the city of Philippi at the time had an unjust view of humanity. Humanity, in Greek mythology, was not created equal. Humanity was created in classes. Okay? And so some classes were made for one sort of work. Other classes were made for other sorts of work. And people were valued in proportion to their vocation and not according to their humanity. But before we start, calling the Greeks stupid for their beliefs, let's realize that most Americans view people this way too, if we're honest, right? Most Americans rank other Americans according to their job and subsequent profitability. Would you agree? Yes. That was the view of the gods. Okay? The ancient Greek people valued people according to their vocation, but the reason they did this is because that was what they were taught was ultimate reality. The school that the Greek children were taught in, from a young age, they learned about the origins of the world in it, in which the gods were constantly at war with each other. And out of warfare, that God placed people into different classes, some to rule and some to be ruled. Okay? Now, we think about that view of the world and we say of it, that's dumb. Right? But I want you to know that the school we place our children in today has no softer of a worldview. Okay? The modern view of the origins of the world is that everything began with a big bang, and then it was the endless process of the strong eating the weak. So how is that any different than the ancient Greek? Right? The ancient Greeks valued the strong, so do we. The ancient Greeks ranked people according to profitability, so do we. Okay? And the reason we do this is the same reason they did it. It's because this was what they were taught was the origin of the world, of how the world was created to function. So the gods of the ancient Greeks had an unjust view of humanity, but humanity also had, get this, a corrupt view of the gods. So the role of worship in Greek mythology was to manipulate the gods to give you what you wanted from them. Which, even Christians do that sometimes. The way you manipulated the gods was through money, or through ritual, or through sexual favors, or through some feat of strength. Do this, and this god will give you this. Okay? So let's come back to the slave girl for a moment. The reason people were willing to pay this slave girl for her divinations was because in paying her, they were manipulating the gods to give them what they wanted. And you can imagine that it almost always worked for them. Why? Because fortune tellers don't make their money off of bad news. Right? You come to a fortune teller because you're afraid of bad news. If you come to a fortune teller and they give you the bad news, you're not coming back. And for this girl, if her customers did not come back, that was not good for her owners. And if it wasn't good for her owners, it wasn't good for her. So, the way you manipulated the gods was through money, paying someone, right? And the more you paid, the more profitable your future seemed. So what the Philippians really cared about was profits. What they really did not care about was the slave girl, because their worldview told them that this slave girl was made a slave by the gods. And so if this was the order of the world that the gods made, we're not going to break it. So we're not really concerned about her being free. We're concerned about being the strong. Okay? So the catch-22 of this whole situation, which is really saddening, is that the only way for this slave girl to be profitable to her owners was for her to speak positively on behalf of the Greek gods. But this was the view of the gods that was the root cause of her slavery in the first place. Think about that. As a diviner, people only returned if she told them what they wanted to hear from the gods. The ancient Greek view of the gods was the very thing that made slavery possible. And now, by being a voice for those gods, this slave girl was perpetuating her own slavery. This slave girl was caught in the horrific cycle of servitude. The more she did what she did, the more likely she was to stay in servitude. Imagine being in that cycle where you feel like, the more I do this, the more I'm enslaved, but if I don't do this, I don't get paid. Right? It's the horrific cycle of the prostitute. It's the horrific cycle of the drug dealer, the sex slave, and the porn star. Her profession enslaves her, and yet her profession sustains her, and the result is perpetual hopelessness and servitude. So this girl, if there's anybody hopeless, this girl is it. Stuck in a body, stuck in a youthful body, enslaved by her masters, enslaved by a spirit. So we see, first of all, in this story, the oppressive cycle of servitude in this girl's life. She is in a hopelessly hopeless spot. The second thing we see the power struggle for freedom in the life of this slave girl. So this slave girl is kind of a curious case for us Westerners. Why? Because for the most part, we don't really believe in divination. For the most part. Right? We don't really believe in the spirit world for us Westerners. We believe in what's called naturalistic philosophy, which is that everything has a scientific explanation. That's kind of what we believe. So this girl, she just confuses us. But I want us to consider a couple things. First of all, naturalistic philosophy. Basically what that says is, everything has a physical cause. So if there's a problem in your life, or if there's some, we'll give an example. If you're depressed, there's a chemical imbalance. If addiction is a physical disease that you caught, like you caught the mumps or something like that. When crimes are committed, they are committed by people who had dysfunctional upbringings, and so the environment is the cause, right? And so a slave girl like this, we would say of her, she has been abused and oppressed all of her life, and as a result, The chemistry of her brain has been rewired, making her susceptible to hallucinations in her desire to escape reality. All right? So we have to be careful here because secularity actually preaches part of the truth. The reality is that because we are both body and spirit, or body and soul, there is always something physical happening inside us alongside the spiritual. Okay? We can point to differences in body chemistry for different people. It's true. Okay? But we walk ourselves into a corner when we reduce all of human behavior to body chemistry or to the spiritual. Let me give you a couple examples. So the best example, I think, of the danger of walking, of reducing everything to the physical, naturalistic philosophy, is the book and later the movie Silence of the Lambs. I don't recommend you see it, but there's one scene that is particularly potent for this point. And so in it, Officer Starling, who is a student at the FBI Academy, challenges Hannibal Lecter, who was a convicted murderer and cannibal, asking him, I say Hannibal Lecter, asking him, what happened to you? He's behind a jail cell. She's sitting in this hallway. She says to him, what happened to you? So she's looking for a naturalistic explanation for his evil, right? And so here's what he said to her. He said, what happened to me? Nothing happened to me. I happened. You can't reduce me to a set of influences. You've given up good and evil for behaviorism, Officer Starling. Right? So you see, if we reduce all of human behavior to naturalistic philosophy, we're naive, because we don't know what to do then with clear acts of evil. It doesn't fit into our grid. Okay? Furthermore, if all human behavior can be explained naturalistically, then all human behavior is determined. You did what you did because this was right of you, right? And so, don't blame me for my behavior. Don't blame me for my behavior, right? So it's kind of a subtle way of blaming God for your behavior. I did this bad act because I had, I was mentally unstable, or whatever the case may be. But worse than that, in naturalistic philosophy, there is actually no such thing as love. Like, love is just molecules. And that's depressing. So we can't reduce all human behavior to naturalistic philosophy, but also we can't reduce all human behavior to the spiritual. And so I think the Bible and the Bible alone actually gives us a balanced approach to humanity. It's not all spiritual, but it's not all physical. And so one chart I thought might be helpful for us in understanding this was by a couple named, what are names here? A couple named Henry and Mary Verkler. And so in this chart here, if you can see it, they give 4 ways that the demonic works in our lives. So four ways we are influenced spiritually in our lives. I think this is very helpful. So they say, first of all, that the first involvement is really no involvement at all. It's just ourselves. And so this would come from James 1, verse 14, where James said, each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desires and enticed. So the first level of demonic involvement in our lives is no demonic involvement at all. Okay? The second level, they say, is what's called demonic temptation. And so this is the area where most of us face our battles every day. We are tempted, the Bible would say, tempted by the evil one, tempted by Satan. This is where most of us sit. The evil one tempts us to fill our minds with inappropriate passions that we know are wrong for us. And so he does this through the power of suggestion. And so examples of this would be Adam and Eve in the garden. Hey, did God really say? Or even Jesus in the desert being tempted for 40 days. Or even Ananias and Sapphira in Acts chapter 5 where they're tempted to lie about how much they gave. Right? So there's this is sort of the place where most of us wrestle against spiritual forces is in temptation. And then the third one is what's called demonic oppression. Okay? And so, different than demonic temptation, demonic oppression happens only after repeated suggestions have led to a weakened ability to see the truth anymore because the demonic lies have been so swallowed hook, line, and sinker. So this would include such things as blindness of heart, hardness of heart toward the gospel. So Paul said in 2 Corinthians 4, he said, the God of this age has blinded the minds of unbelievers so that they cannot see the light of the gospel. There's sort of a searing that happens. You just won't see it anymore. It would also include such things as apostasy and doctrinal corruption, which Paul said, in latter times, some will abandon the faith and follow deceiving spirits and things taught by demons. Such teachings come through hypocritical liars whose consciences have been seared as with a hot iron. So we have no demonic involvement at all. We have the demonic temptation, which I think the majority of us wrestle with. And then this third one is demonic oppression, where we have so welcomed the devil's lies over time that our conscience has been seared. There's nothing you can say to really change this person's mind. And then the last involvement is this spirit girl, servant girl. It's demonic possession. Demonic possession happens when an individual chooses to intentionally welcome the demonic into their lives. And so people do this today through Satan worship. They do this through psychedelic drugs. They do this through various dark ways. And so whenever a person welcomes the demonic into their lives, the demonic comes in and eventually possesses. It doesn't want to just come in and visit and say hi for a time. It comes in and it refuses to leave. It possesses, literally, okay? And the best thing we have to, I think the best thing we have today to understand what demonic possession is like, the best thing we have today to understand it is in the experience of those who have been addicted to the really hard substances like cocaine, methamphetamines, heroin. So how is that similar? I had a counseling session last year with a gentleman who was addicted to heroin. And he had some, really heroin and alcohol was his as well. But he told me the story about that he used to smoke pot in high school. And he said, that was cool for me. Like I could still maintain my personality. I still knew who I was. Nobody really recognized a difference in me. I just felt different. He said, but when I started to use the harder stuff, like meth, he said, I lost who I was. Like that drug literally possessed me, he said. His words were, the drug possessed me and took me over, and I did things I thought I would never do in my life. I didn't even know who I was. Okay? This man had an experience similar to demon possession in that he welcomed something into his life that was so powerful and so dark that it possessed him. And it's like he couldn't get away from it. And so the very best thing you can do with hard drugs, the very best thing you can do with the demonic is to never invite it into your life in the first place. Because once you invite it in, boy, now it's trouble getting them out. Okay? And so, this slave girl had at some point made a decision, though she was young, we can understand her decision. At some point she made a decision to welcome the spirit of the python into her life, and the result was she was completely taken over by it, and she could not free herself from it. Okay? And because this girl was demon-possessed, her salvation was going to come about as a result of a power struggle between her demon and Jesus Christ. Okay? And this is what Paul said in verse 18. I command you in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ to come out of her. And I think the reason, did you notice it said, Paul was so annoyed? Paul and Silas were annoyed at this girl. Like, I guess one preacher was saying, he said, that's actually a pretty good reason to believe that the Bible is not, like, made up. Because that just really makes Paul and Silas look bad. Like, this poor girl, enslaved, get away from me, you annoying, he's annoyed. But he says it. That's Paul, he's human, he's not Jesus. And so, this girl keeps following them, saying, these men are servants of the Most High God. Paul and Silas are annoyed. And it says in verse 18, this she kept on doing many days. Having become greatly annoyed, they turned and said to the spirit, come out of her. But here's why. This gives us, I think, very good insight into how we interact with people who are possessed, either by demons or by drugs today, that they literally can't free themselves from. Paul and Silas made a distinction between this 10-year-old girl possessed by this spirit and the Spirit. I believe Paul and Silas said, notice you didn't ask to be set free. Would you guys please let me free? No, there was no asking. But Paul and Silas set her free anyway. Why? Because I think they knew that this girl was not herself. She was possessed. They had compassion on her. And so it says in verse 18, she kept on doing for many days. The girl kept on doing this for many days. Having become greatly annoyed, they turned to the Spirit. So this girl's doing it. Paul and Silas turned to the Spirit and say, come out of her. Paul was annoyed not at the girl, but at the spirit in the girl which had possessed her. And again, I think this gives us great insight into how we treat people possessed by substances today. Yes, they welcome the substance into their life, but the reality is there is now a young man or a young woman inside that body that is possessed by a substance they cannot free themselves from. And in order to be totally free of their possessor, they must first admit they are powerless to free themselves. That's step one in any recovery program. I can't free myself. And then secondly, they need to rely on a power greater than themselves to restore them to sanity. When something possesses us, that thing that possesses us, be it a demon or a substance, will not unpossess us without a struggle. Okay? This slave girl needed a power encounter with Jesus Christ in order to be free. She could not free herself. And so we see the oppressive cycle of servitude. Everything's against this girl. The more she does what she does, the deeper in it she is. Secondly, we see the power struggle for freedom in the life of this. There has to be a power, for someone who's possessed, there has to be a power encounter with Jesus. And then lastly, we see the tangible, that's not the right one. We see the difference, the undeniable difference the gospel makes. So we'll close with this. The only God this slave girl ever knew was a God who possessed and oppressed. Her God was impersonal. Her God could not be known, nor could it know her. The best she could hope for as a worshiper of this God was to appease his wrath by giving proper worship at proper times. And when Paul and Silas cast out the demon from her, she was then able to sit in her right mind for the first time and hear and take in about a different God. The only God she had ever known was a God who possessed and oppressed. Paul and Silas say, come out of her. She now sits at Paul and Silas' feet, and what does she hear? The majority of us, wrong page. What does she hear? It's really hard without a stand, by the way. Maureen Sue, I sympathize with you there. Okay. So let's here's what she would have learned. She would have learned that the God of the Bible is a personal God. The God of the Bible knows her and wants her to know him. She learned that the God of the Bible refuses to control people. The only God she ever knew was a God who took over and wouldn't let her speak. She now learned of a God who refuses to control her. He refuses to take people over. He refuses to force people to serve him. She learned that the God of the Bible does not want to enslave people. He wants to free people. She learned that the God of the Bible does not love people if they worship right. The God of the Bible loves people, and then calls them to live a life of worship. She learned that the God of the Bible does not demand sacrifice and then promise prosperity. She learned that the God of the Bible sacrificed himself so that we could have ultimate prosperity. She learned that the God of the universe does not rank people according to vocation. Americans. She learned that the God of the Bible ranks everyone equally, from the mightiest king to the most helpless slave. She learned that God loves people not because they are good. She learned that God loves people even if they are bad, but because he loves people, he wants them to be good. She learned that although she was in a cycle of servitude, she was not hopelessly stuck. In fact, when Paul and Silas were released from jail at the end of the jailer's story, in verse 40, which is the last verse of the chapter, it reads, "After Paul and Silas came out of the prison, they went to Lydia's house, where they met the brothers and encouraged them. Then they left." So it was likely that Paul and Silas went to Lydia's house, and the slave girl was there too. The masters abandoned her. Her city abandoned her, but now there was a new church in Philippi that said, "You're welcome here." But what probably, I think, gripped her heart more than anything else was the discovery that the God of the universe, rather than kidnap servants to work in his palace, the God of the universe left his palace to become a servant. The God of the universe knew what it was like to be oppressed because he left heaven to endure oppression. The God of the universe knew what it was like to be abandoned because he left heaven to be abandoned on the cross. The God of the universe knew what it was like to be orphaned because Jesus left his Father's side to have his Father turn his face from him on the cross and temporarily be orphaned. The God of the universe knew what it was like to feel powerless because Jesus left heaven to walk powerlessly to the cross, and in that powerless act defeated the powerful death. The majority of us here today do not struggle with demon possession or even demon oppression. But every one of us is in a power struggle with something that wants to be our God. Every person in Laconia is tempted today to place something in the God role in their lives, which, if it ascends to that position, will oppress them and destroy them. If you place a particular relationship in the God role in your life, that relationship will oppress you and destroy you, especially if it breaks down. If you place money or success in the God role in your life, it will oppress you and destroy you. If you become successful, you look down on others who aren't successful and say, "Why don't you do what I did?" Or, if you don't become successful, you feel like a loser. If you place health and beauty in the God role in your life, it will oppress you and destroy you because you will never feel healthy enough and you will never feel beautiful enough. It goes without saying that if you put drugs or alcohol or any other substance in the God role in your life, it will oppress you and destroy you because there will never be enough of it to satisfy you. No drug addict ever stops and says, "I've had enough." No. It's an incessant desire that it possesses, and it doesn't go away. If you place being a good person in the God role, I'm a good person. I'm not the best. I'm not the worst. I'm pretty good, which is okay. You can be the God of your own life, apparently. If you place being a good person in the God role in your life, it will oppress you and destroy you because if you're honest with yourself, the deeper you look inside yourself, the more darkness you will see. If you're honest. Folks, the only thing that we can place in the God role in our lives, which will not oppress us and destroy us and leave us empty, is Jesus Christ. The slave girl discovered that and was set free from a horrible, hopeless cycle. Do you believe it too? Is it true for you? If if you believe it here, has it been true in your life? Or has something else, practically speaking, been your God? The way to answer that is say, what is it that makes me, that quickly makes me most afraid? And I had to do kind of a gut check when we moved here from New Jersey, because the thing that brought me the most fear was losing my wife. I may have told her this, I may not have. I was afraid of losing my wife. I was afraid that, listen, God has done so much in my life through my wife. What would happen if I lost her? And so what I noticed is I began to be kind of controlling. Why do you have to go out tonight? Like, why do you have to drive there? Do you really have to go on a trip with your friends? Like, can't you just stay home? Right? I became controlling. Why? Because she was becoming my God. She was becoming the thing I could not live without. And if I had allowed that to grow in my life, it would have possessed me and it would have destroyed me. I cannot place anything else but Jesus Christ and the God role in my life and have it not possess me and destroy me. So what is that thing for you? What is the thing that's at the center that you don't want at the center in